Athens 2,400 years ago. It's a compact place. Only about 250,000 people live here. There are fine baths, theatres, temples, shopping arcades and gymnasiums. It's warm for more than half the year. This is also home to the world's first true and probably greatest philosopher, Plato. Born into a prominent and wealthy family in the city, Plato devoted his life to one goal, helping people to reach a state of what he termed eudaimonia, or fulfillment. Plato is often confused with Socrates. Socrates was an older friend who taught Plato a lot but didn't write any books. Plato wrote lots of them, 36, all dialogues, beautifully crafted scripts of imaginary discussions in which Socrates is always allotted a starring role, among them the Republic, the Symposium, the Laws, the Meno and the Apology. Plato had 4 big ideas for making life more fulfilled. First big idea, think more. We rarely give ourselves time to think carefully and logically about our lives and how to lead them. Sometimes we just go along with what the Greeks called doxa, or popular opinions. In the 36 books he wrote, Plato showed this common sense to be riddled with errors, prejudice and superstition. Fame is great, follow your heart, money is the key to a good life. The problem is, popular opinions edge us towards the wrong values, careers and relationships. Plato's answer is, know yourself. It means doing a special kind of therapy, philosophy, subjecting your ideas to examination rather than acting on impulse. If you strengthen your self-knowledge, you don't get so pulled around by feelings. Plato compared the role of our feelings to being dragged dangerously along by a group of wild horses. In honour of his mentor and friend Socrates, this kind of examination is called a Socratic discussion. You can have it with yourself or, ideally, with another person who isn't trying to catch you out, but wants to help you clarify your own ideas. Second big idea, let your lover change you. That sounds weird if you think that love means finding someone who wants you just the way you are. In a Symposium, Plato's play about a dinner party where a group of friends drink too much and get talking about love, sex and relationships, Plato says, true love is admiration. In other words, the person you need to get together with should have very good qualities, which you yourself lack. Let's say they should be really brave or organised or warm and sincere. By getting close to this person, you can become a little like they are. The right person for us helps us grow to our full potential. For Plato, in a good relationship, a couple shouldn't love each other exactly as they are right now. They should be committed to educating each other and to enduring the stormy passages this inevitably involves. Each person should want to seduce the other into becoming a better version of themselves. 3. Decode the message of beauty. Everyone pretty much likes beautiful things, but Plato was the first to ask, why do we like them? He found a fascinating reason. Beautiful objects are whispering important truths to us about the good life. We find things beautiful when we unconsciously sense in them qualities we need but are missing in our lives. Gentleness, harmony, balance, peace, strength. Beautiful objects, therefore, have a really important function. They help to educate our souls. Ugliness is a serious matter too. It parades dangerous and damaged characteristics in front of us. It makes it harder to be wise, kind and calm. Plato sees art as therapeutic. It's the duty of poets and painters and nowadays novelists, TV producers and designers to help us to live good lives. 4. Reform society. Plato spent a lot of time thinking how the government and society should ideally be. He was the world's first utopian thinker. In this, he was inspired by Athens' great rival, Sparta. This was a city-sized machine for turning out great soldiers. Everything the Spartans did, how they raised their children, how their economy was organised, whom they admired, how they had sex, what they ate, was tailored to that one goal. And Sparta was hugely successful from a military point of view. But that wasn't Plato's concern. He wanted to know, how could a society get better at producing not military power, but fulfilled people? In his book, The Republic, Plato identifies a number of changes that should be made. Athenian society was very focused on the rich, like the louche aristocrat Alcibiades, and sports celebrities like the boxer Milo of Croton. Plato wasn't impressed. It really matters who we admire, because celebrities influence our outlook, ideas and conduct, and bad heroes give glamour to flaws of character. Plato therefore wanted to give Athens new celebrities, replacing the current crop with ideally wise and good people he called guardians, models for everyone's good development. These people would be distinguished by their record of public service, their modesty and simple habits, their dislike of the limelight, and their wide and deep experience. They would be the most honoured and admired people in society. He also wanted to end democracy in Athens. He wasn't crazy. He just observed how few people think properly before they vote, and therefore we get very substandard rulers. He didn't want to replace democracy with a horrid dictatorship, but he wanted to prevent people from voting until they'd started to think rationally. That is, until they'd become philosophers. Otherwise, government would just be a kind of mob rule. To help the process, Plato started a school, the Academy, in Athens, which lasted a good 300 years. There, pupils learnt not just maths and spelling, but also how to be good and kind. His ultimate goal was that politicians should become philosophers. The world will not be right, he said, until kings become philosophers or philosophers kings. Asking oneself and others what the perfect version of something is, the ideal version, might sound like a strange idea. What is the perfect marriage, or career, or system of government, or school? It can feel immature and naive to bother much with such questions. They're just daydreams. After all, who cares about ideal versions? We might as well deal with what we've got. But the great ancient Greek philosopher Plato strenuously disagrees with this. Throughout his work, he argues that focusing on the ideal version of something is one of the most useful kinds of thought exercises we can generate. It's by knowing what we think something should be like that we can more clearly start to define what might be wrong and focus on what we need to do to make the world slightly better. When he was talking about ideals, Plato used a slightly strange but ultimately rather useful word, the forms. So he asked not what is the ideal friendship or the ideal kind of parental love, he asked what is the form of friendship or the form of parental love. It does sound strange, but what he had in mind was something very practical. When a Greek stonemason was carving an ornament, they wouldn't just make it up themselves. They'd make use of a wooden template, or form, to check if they were getting it right. The form itself was made by the master, but if the mason possessed the form, they could more reliably do perfect work. This is Plato's basic picture of what an ideal is. It's the guide you need that shows you how to do something well yourself. If you've got possession of the form, you can be guided towards a true goal. A form, as Plato sees it, is a blueprint, a set of instructions for making a very good version of something. That's why we all need a well-thought-through set of forms to guide us in life. And, unsurprisingly, it is philosophy that can guide us to these forms. So, for example, the form of friendship is a mental model of what a really good friendship actually involves. And if you grasp this model, if this idea is active in your mind, you will know how to be a good friend. Similarly, having a form of education in mind is going to be very useful for the teacher. It'll stop her being buffeted by events and day-to-day pressures. She'll be able to keep in mind where, ideally, she should be going. We've typically thought of ideals as fantasy projections that blithely ignore most of what life is actually like. We think of them as the opposite of being realistic. But Plato sees an ideal as the result of a deep understanding and careful engagement with reality. Someone setting up an airport would need, in the Platonic scheme, to have in mind the ideal air traffic control system, something optimally effective, efficient, and safe. This is the person who would, in Plato's terms, have grasped the form of air traffic control. We all need to have as many forms in mind as we possibly can. Plato is breaking the habitual assumption that searching for the ideal is at odds with getting things done in the rough and tumble of the real world. And he's pushing us to be more exacting about where we are trying to head to. If an ideal seems utterly distant and hopeless, maybe the problem isn't that it's too idealistic, but, in a strange but important way, actually not idealistic enough. That is, we've not quite yet discovered the form. We shouldn't abandon our ideals. We should get more ambitious about them, and Plato's philosophy is on hand to help us. The The ancient Greeks were emphatic that philosophy was not just an elaborate abstract exercise. It was, they felt, a deeply useful skill that should be learnt and practiced by all in order to help us to live and die well. No one believed this more than Plato, who was passionate in his defense of philosophy as a kind of therapy for the soul. One of the most forceful stories he told on behalf of the utility of philosophy was what has become known as the allegory of the cave. It is perhaps the most famous allegory in philosophy. This was a story that was intended, as he wrote, to compare the effect of education and the lack of it on our nature. At the start of Book 7 of his masterpiece, The Republic, Plato tells us about some people living imprisoned in a cave. They've always lived there and don't know anything of the outside world. There is no natural light in this cave. The walls are damp and dark. All the inhabitants can see comes from the shadows of things thrown up on the wall by a light of a fire. The cave dwellers get fascinated by these reflections of animals, plants, and people. Moreover, they assume that these shadows are real, and that if you pay a lot of attention to them, you'll understand and succeed in life. They don't, of course, realize that they are looking at mere phantoms. They chat about shadowy things enthusiastically and take great pride in their sophistication and wisdom. Then, one day, quite by chance, someone discovers a way out of the cave, out into the open air. At first, it's simply overwhelming. He is dazzled by the brilliant sunshine, in which everything is for the first time properly illuminated. Gradually, his eyes adjust, and he encounters the true forms of all those things which he had formerly known only as shadows. He sees actual flowers, the colours of birds, the nuances in the bark of trees. He observes stars and grasps the vastness and sublime nature of the universe. As Plato puts it in solemn terms, previously he had been looking merely at phantoms. Now he is nearer to the true nature of being. Out of compassion, this newly enlightened man decides to leave the sunlit upper world and makes his way back into the cave to try to help out his companions, who are still mired in confusion and error. Because he's become used to the bright upper world, he can hardly see anything underground. He stumbles along the damp, wet corridors and gets confused. He seems to the others totally unimpressive. When he in turn is unimpressed by them and insists on explaining what the sun is or what a real tree is like, the cave dwellers get sarcastic, then very angry, and eventually plot to kill him. The story of the cave is an allegory of the life of all enlightened people. The cave dwellers are humans before philosophy. The sun is the light of reason. The alienation of the returned philosopher is what all truth-tellers can expect when they take their knowledge back to people who have not devoted themselves to thinking. For Plato, we are all for much of our lives in shadow. Many of the things we get excited about, like fame, the perfect partner, a high-status job, are infinitely less real than we suppose. They are, for the most part, phantoms projected by our culture onto the walls of our fragile and flawed minds. But because everyone around us is insisting that they are genuine, we are taken in from a young age. It's not our fault individually. No one chooses to be in the cave. That's just where we happen to begin. We're all starting from a very difficult place. If, like the man in Plato's story, you bluntly tell people they're wrong, you get nowhere, you cause deep offence and may endanger your own life. Athens had, after all, recently put Socrates, Plato's friend, to death. Plato knew from close experience just what the cave dwellers might do to those who claim to know the sun. The solution, Plato says, is a process of widespread, carefully administered philosophical education, by which he understood the method of inquiry pioneered by Socrates and known to us as the Socratic method. It's a very gentle process. You don't lecture or harangue or force someone to read a particular book. You just start with a general declaration of intellectual modesty. No one knows very much. It's always good to insist. And wisdom starts with owning up to ignorance. Confess that you don't know exactly what the government should do, what war is meant to achieve, or how good relationships work. You then get the other person to say what they think, and gradually, together, you investigate the answers. Most likely, the other person will be confident, or rather painfully, overconfident. They may tell you it's all quite simple, really, and everyone knows the answer already. You must be supremely patient with this kind of bravado. If they go off topic, you must cheerfully double back. You must take a lot of time and be ready to have chats over many days. This method of talking is founded on a lovely confidence that with the right encouragement, people can eventually work out things for themselves and detect errors in their own reasoning if you carefully and quietly draw their attention to tricky points and don't cast blame or ever get annoyed. You never teach anyone anything by making them feel stupid, even if they are at first. We have all started in that cave, but it is Plato's deepest insight that we don't have to stay there. And the road out is called, quite simply, philosophy. This is the sun whose light we can follow, and by whose rays the proper nature of things can become clear.